Hello everybody. So for today we're covering the concept of biopower. This is a concept that comes from Michel Foucault in particular, although there are other important theorists who we will talk about, such as Agamben. And this is the kind of big theoretical concept of violence, or a theory of violence that we're going to be using, and in the classes that follow, we'll see a lot of examples of what biopower looks like on the ground using ethnographic case studies. So I have for you a picture of Foucault in his iconic leather jacket and a picture of a concentration camp, because so much of these theories are about trying to figure out what happens with the modern nation state that enables these new structures, these new institutions, such as concentration camps, eugenics, and genocide. So y'all read some Foucault, as well as Beale, who gives us a lovely example of what biopower looks like in the context of this institution Vita in Brazil. But before going into any of that, I want to give a brief overview of what biopower is. In short, the PowerPoint as a whole, this lecture as a whole, will unpack that concept because it is a pretty complicated concept, but here's the short version. Biopower refers to the state management and distribution of life and death. Essentially, what's happening is that the body, as a physiological and biological entity, becomes the object of governance. The state is no longer only governing, the state is not governing just people or citizens, but biological organisms, with the objective of fostering life, making live is a phrase you'll hear a lot, or disallowing life to the point of death, which can either look like making die, or even just letting die, putting people in situations where they are more likely to die. Beale talks a little bit about this. So basically what we're seeing when I talk about this idea is a radical transformation of how governments operate with the rise of what we would think of as the modern nation state. The nation state imagines itself in relationship to this new entity called a nation, which is a group of people or population, compared to a monarchy, where the state is embodied through the body of the king or the queen, the monarch. And what happens with this idea of the nation state is, again, the government legitimizes itself through and seeks to operate. The government seeks to operate in this radical new way that's really about governing people as biological entities. There are different forms that biopower can take. Foucault distinguishes between disciplinary and regulatory forms. I'll talk more about that later in the PowerPoint. And the objective of all of this is that the nation state seeks to control bodies and normalize populations, producing proper subjects, normalizing populations to produce proper subjects, citizens, and nations. So this idea of the population, which we often take for granted, is actually a function of biopolitical governance. The social construct of a population transforms our way. It's what Beale calls, I forget, what does he call it, like a reality generating or a reality transformative concept, where suddenly we can conceive of the world in terms of these populations that can be known through techniques like statistics or demographics, and that can be governed as a population. So when you have scholars like Foucault, we saw the same thing with Hannah Arendt. Foucault is really thinking about this relationship between fascism and democracy. How is it that fascist states emerge in the leading up to World War II out of democratic states, leading to events like the Holocaust? How the fuck does this happen? This is the overarching question of philosophy in this time period. And through this concept of biopower, Foucault is going to argue that whether we're talking about democratic states or a fascist state, both share the same foundational practices and assumptions in the way they govern. And because of that, we can think of them less as opposites and more as different sides of the same coin, maybe different ends of a spectrum, or maybe it's just a question of democracy for whom. There's lovely scholarship that unfortunately I had to cut from the class coming from the Black Panther Party that talks about the ways in which the so-called democracy of the United States imposes itself through fascist techniques in specifically poor Black communities. So these techniques that are shared by demographic and fascist entities are basically this concept of biopower, which operate through these social constructions of things like race, population, etc. And this fundamental assumption that the object of governance, the entity that the state should govern, is the biological organism, as well as the citizen. It's really these two sides, citizen and biological organism, that are at the heart of how the modern nation state, or the biopolitical nation state, constructs the world and operates. We'll come back to that when we get to Agamben, because that contradiction where we're simultaneously a citizen and a biological organism is quite fascinating. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about how Foucault conceptualizes power more broadly. Because power for Foucault is not just repressive. It's not just about saying no. It's not just about saying what you can't do or punishing you for, what's the word I'm looking for violating norms. And it's not just about limiting who you are as a person. Foucault is really critical, for example, of the queer liberation movement, because his argument is it's not that our sexuality is repressed by Victorian social norms. It's that Victorian ways of understanding what it means to be human have shaped the very possibilities on which we're able to claim any identity whatsoever, including queer identities. I'll come back more to that anymore. But the point here, right, is power is not just repressive, it's generative. Power generates social orders, and it generates social possibilities. Power also can resist those orders and possibilities. So here we see that power is diffuse, complex, and often contradictory. He's less concerned in top-down models of power, the idea that power is something that is imposed upon us, that we need to liberate ourselves from. And instead, he's more interested in the kind of complicated, we could say cultural dynamics, right? Cultural patterns, and how they intersect in really sometimes contradictory ways. Power can operate from the ground up. It can also operate from the top down. And essentially what happens is power produces what he calls subjects or selves. What does it mean to be a person? That's the subject. Who am I? Let's do an example. Who am I? Here I am a queer woman. Or we could say a queer transgender woman. Foucault's point is that we have to understand the very possibilities by which I'm able to claim an identity, queer, transgender woman, as a function of historical power relationships, right? How does this idea of queer, of transgender, lesbian, how do all of these terms how are they given meaning over time? How are these terms defined, particularly within scientific fields? And then how do those fields of study, those fields of knowledge, come to define the possibilities in which we're able to imagine who we are as people? So Foucault sometimes talks about power or knowledge, and he uses those two in a connected way, as doubly subjecting us. And the idea is we are made into subjects, or we are made into selves through these power relationships. And at the same time, we are subjected to these ideas. We are subjected to these knowledges. If I say I'm a lesbian, I am subjecting myself to the legacies of basically 19th century Victorian studies of sexual identity. We'll come back to that example in a minute, right? So as you can see here, for Foucault, power and knowledge are two sides of the same coin. He often talks about regimes of knowledge and truth, as well as that are also regimes that govern institutions. So, for example, sexuality, the idea of sexual identity, is what he would call a regime. It is a set of ideas and studies created historically that then come to define our ideas about the world, who we are as people, and how our institutions should operate. He's also very interested, for example, in the measuring of demographics as a part of state government. So for a state to create policies that are meant to govern a population, right? This is the model of biopower. The state governs the population. The state first has to develop knowledge about what that population is. So we get things like the study of demographics. And the study of demographics is both informed by power dynamics. For example, our categories of, let's say, race, which are indebted to the history of white supremacy and colonialism. Those racial categories become meaningful categories to measure. And that knowledge of demographics also shapes state policy. So there's a kind of cyclical relationship between power and knowledge there. I'll come back to that whole idea of subject formation and Victorian politics of sexuality in a minute. But for now, I want to talk about one of your readings, Society Must Be Defended. This is one of the key texts where Foucault defines his thinking on biopower. And we see several key dynamics, right? And even the name, Society Must Be Defended, that tells us the kind of logics that Foucault is interested, right? Like, so defended against who? Who is considered a threat to society? Foucault is ultimately interested in new systems of governance, new regimes of power that function by demarcating groups as a threat to society and then defending society against those groups. Again, here we're looking at the logics of population. It's groups of people, populations of people from which society is under threat. So essentially, right, what's happening is society is functioning, or these power regimes function by demarcating quote-unquote undesirable populations. These are racial populations. Foucault argues that racial demographics and racism is a fundamental structure of the modern nation. Because what the nation does, right, is it defines who is part of that nation and who is not. It's other kinds of populations that are demarcated as a threat to society include criminals, mentally ill populations, sexual deviants, and so forth, right? The idea is to mark populations as outside and a threat to. The goal, then, of biopower is to normalize the nation through these population dynamics. So, for example, if part of the quote-unquote problem, and I'm using problem in scare quotes because, we'll talk more about this when we read Lisa Stevenson's work and what it means to be constructed as a problem. For example, the quote-unquote Indian problem historically, or the black problem, or the Jewish problem. But when you are constructed as a population, let's say as a mentally ill population, what the state seeks to do is normalize you, right? If you are in this exterior category, you are isolated, you are put in an asylum or a mental health hospital, and the goal is usually to quote-unquote rehabilitate you, to transform you into a proper subject, a proper person who can then be reintroduced as a productive member of society. We see this kind of logic a lot with criminality, right? Again, the idea that society must be defended from criminals. So you isolate criminals in a prison where you subject them to forms of control, and you, in theory, seek to rehabilitate them, to recover them as a person, to make them into a proper citizen, and reintroduce them into mainstream society as, again, a quote-unquote productive member of society. Racial populations are part of this as well. Foucault argues that this kind of demographic thinking, this population-based modes of governance, is part of what enables genocide, eugenics, etc. And there's a reason, right? When we talk about prisons and mental asylums, to go back to the earlier two examples, there's a reason why prisons and mental hospitals, and any kind of hospital really, the architecture is quite similar. It's a very effective kind of architecture for accomplishing these kinds of core tasks, right? Isolating populations, isolating them from larger society, but also from one another through like individualized rooms, placing them in situations where their movements are highly controlled and regimented. You can't leave your cell except for certain times of day. And you can be watched. You are being watched all the time. So this is what Foucault talks about as disciplinary institutions or disciplinary practices. The idea is to discipline undesirable populations into becoming, into normalizing them, into becoming, quote unquote, again, productive members of society. Here's another good example is boarding schools for indigenous peoples, right? The idea is to take indigenous children from their families, isolate them, and transform them into proper civilized subjects where they can integrate into white society, integrate or assimilate. The idea is again this idea of normalization, of transforming bodies that are marked undesirable or deviant into proper citizens of the nation. So this logic, right, this dichotomy between the citizen and the non-citizen is an essential piece of biopower. Essentially, when we talk about this dichotomy, citizen and non-citizen, we're talking about who is granted rights and protections within the state and who is constructed as outside of the nation. And the thing is, there are clear-cut legal categories in some cases. For example, undocumented immigrants are subject to all kinds of violence because they are legally not considered citizens. But there's also a lot of slippage where one can ask, like, do you really have full citizenship? For example, we could look at Black Lives Matter and police brutality. What are the instances, what are the moments in which black men and women are not granted or assumed to have the rights and protections granted to citizens and are really considered partial citizens in practice, if not in law. So this is really what biopower is about. It's the set of logics and bureaucratic machinations and systems of ideas that determine who is a citizen and who is not. So we saw this a little bit in Hannah Arendt earlier this semester, right? Where she kind of mentions in passing that the ways that Nazis were able to enact the Holocaust first required them to strip German Jewish people of their citizenship. By transforming Jewish people into non-citizens, they were able to enact violence on those bodies without it being considered a crime, because those bodies were no longer protected by the rights granted towards citizens. So as Foucault is arguing, this is a radical transformation from older forms of government. And his example, his contrastive example, is the monarch. And so in his idea, the monarch exercises power primarily by taking life or letting live. In contrast, biopower functions a bit differently. Now, power operates not only by it's not just I will kill you or punish you, or I'll just let you be. Instead, the state seeks to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. So when we look at the boarding school example, right, the idea is to take indigenous children away from their families, put them in these institutions, and foster their lives. But foster very specific forms of life as subjects who could be quote unquote, or subjects who could be transformed or assimilated into whiteness or into civilization as the people who ran these boarding schools saw it. Prisons, right? Mental health institutions. Again, these are institutions, they don't kill you. They foster life, but they foster very specific forms of life. So here, the shift, right, is essentially from a monarchist understanding of governance rooted in killing to a modern nation state in which the object of life and the way power operates, the way the state operates, is not by killing necessarily or exclusively, but also by transforming the body and the person into a biological object and a citizen. A citizen capable of policing themselves. A body capable of operating within normal, quote-unquote, normative society, and in quote-unquote legal ways. So at root here is also a transformation in how we construct what it means to be a person or a human being. This is what Beale calls a reality principle, right? We see a new reality principle that functionally reorganizes society in these new lines. So Foucault talks about this as sovereign power or the monarch works through deduction. You seize life to suppress it. You seize a criminal in order to find them or execute them. Whereas biopower works through administrations. The idea is to manage and normalize life. And again, by normalize, I mean to take populations, to mark certain populations as deviant, isolate them, and try to, quote-unquote, rehabilitate them as proper citizens or proper persons, proper subjects. So here we're operating not on the level of necessarily the individual, but on the level of species and populations. Again, the biological and the demographic objects are what's key here. So we see this through the statistical analysis of populations, for example, the counting of birth rates and death rates, public hygiene, managing illness and healthcare, eugenics and genocide, all of this, right? The state is now involved in managing the life and the death of populations. And to do that, it needs to produce a lot of knowledge. For example, birth rates and death rates, public hygiene, all of this kind of stuff. All of this gets wrapped up into the art of governance. So as Beale says, a whole new reality principle came into existence. Each individual was located, examined, and categorized as living, sick, or dead. In that example, Beale is talking specifically about what happens in the bubonic plague, but the idea, right, is we're seeing a social transformation where the principles through which we understand reality, the ways we construct reality, are starting to shift here, and how we imagine the person is starting to shift. Now, once we see the emergence of this of what Foucault is calling biopower, or the biopolitical state, take shape, we see what he describes as two distinctive poles of biopower. there's two complementary ways biopower operates. One is regulatory power, or what he calls regulatory power, or at times biopolitics, right? And the target of regulatory power is the population, species, or race. This is what I mean. This is what I've been talking about in terms of the state as targeting populations, right? Here, the goal of the state is to regulate populations, the species, or races as a whole. So you get a lot of studies of demographics. You get a lot of social scientists, sociologists, economicists, all of whom are producing knowledge needed to understand and govern at the level of populations. On the other pole, you see disciplinary power. Disciplinary power targets individual bodies. And the idea here, right, is you see these particular institutions that function to discipline. Schools, armies, prisons, asylums, hospitals, workshops, right? The idea is to take individual bodies and discipline them into becoming proper citizens. Again, proper subjects, proper persons. And there's a whole scientific apparatus tied up in these power dynamics as well. For example, criminology, psychiatry, educators and tests, right? School, of course, is about taking children and teaching them how to be proper citizens, proper subjects. So here, what you're seeing is the state emerging as something that governs entire ways of life in a way that the monarchs just couldn't, their power just didn't reach that far. So on the one hand, you have disciplinary power, the disciplining of individual bodies through institutions like schools or prisons, etc. And then you see the regulatory power, the population level regulatory dynamics. For example, coming up with healthcare policies, studying demographics, etc. So here's an example to illustrate these ideas, right? When you steal something, what happens? Within this idea of sovereign power or the monarchy, the monarch or the sovereign punishes the thief for their crime. Maybe they're executed, maybe they're exiled, maybe they're subjected to public humiliation, like put in stocks, or maybe they're fined. Right here, the sovereign operates through deducing, through seizing life and suppressing it. Biopower functions in two ways simultaneously, disciplinary and regulatory. Within a biopolitical regime, the thief is seized and imprisoned, and they're made to undergo a trial. And through these kinds of institutions, there's an interest in the thief's character. Can they be reformed? Will they recommit crimes? Can the prison system function to reform them, essentially? And there are whole systems of knowledge that function to seek knowledge, as well as institutions that function to control and predict the thief's life. Prison, parole, psychiatric processes. So in addition to the disciplining of individual thieves, then there's also the regulatory or biopolitical aspect of it, which are, again, this demographic level questions. Are crime rates rising and falling? Are crime rates higher in certain populations than others? Though that kind of knowledge could be used, for example, to allocate police resources and police certain communities more heavily. And then you can also, within these kinds of cultural logics of personhood, of demographic, thinking of populations, you start to see questions, which you still see all the time in criminology. Are different demographic groups genetically predisposed to commit crimes? Are Black people more genetically predisposed to commit crimes? I'm not asking that as a serious question. I hope the answer is that race is socially constructed. I hope everyone's aware that that is the answer. But the very question itself becomes thinkable, becomes possible within these biopolitical logics of population, of race, of demographics. So really quickly, I'm going to go through an example of this phenomenon using Foucault's idea of the history of sexuality. Foucault's basic argument is that sexuality and sexual identity are socially constructed. These categories don't just naturally exist. They're not ahistorical, but rather they're created within particular historical moments and power relations. And here, Foucault is really critical of sexual liberation movements. Foucault was, he wouldn't call himself gay. Other people would call themselves gay. He actually was part of what was called the homophile movement at the time. And he was really critical of this idea of sexual identity. And his argument, again, was power doesn't function to just repress sexuality. It's not that our sexualities are repressed by Victorian social norms and we need to liberate to live our sexuality more fully. Instead, his argument is that power produces the terms of possible selfhood. Key to this is his understanding of the science of sexology in the 19th century. His argument is that within this field of study, sexology, human sexuality becomes an object of science. It's now something to be studied, to be known, to be organized and cataloged rationally through scientific pursuits. Primarily, this is accomplished by creating a bunch of different categories of what was considered deviance, improper ways of being sexual. So you start to see the coining of new terms, such as heterosexuality is a new term that emerges in this time period. And interestingly, heterosexuality is first defined not the way we think of it today, but as a category of deviance for people who are too sexual. They have too much sexual drive, and that's kind of they're also a category of deviance. The homosexual becomes a category, right? The person who has sex with other people of the same gender. And so you see these new categories emerging through these scientific pursuits, these new categories of personhood. And what happens, and so as they're doing this, they're categorizing all these forms of deviance, and in doing so implicitly constructing the norm. Again, that idea of the proper subject, the proper citizen. So you can see how this is going to become a technique of normalization, where people marked as in excess of the normal, are going to be subjected to disciplinary practices and procedures. Such as the institutionalization of gay people within mental asylums historically. And as Foucault's argument is that what's happening in this moment is a reconceptualizing of sex, where when we talk about the category of the homosexual, we're talking about something that's constructed, someone who's constructed as a type of person, right? To be homosexual is to be a type of person. Whereas earlier, there wasn't this idea of homosexuality. Legal codes especially operated instead along this concept of sodomy. But sodomy is a sex act. It's not a sexual identity. It's something you do. It's not who you are. And so suddenly this act becomes enrolled with now you're a certain kind of person because of that act. And so we see the proliferation of categories of different kinds of deviance in this period. Bisexuality, homosexuality, gay, lesbian, all of these terms. There's just a proliferation of terminology to categorize forms of deviance. And as Foucault is thinking through this, one of the things he's thinking about is okay, why are we talking about sexuality as identity versus bodily pleasure? Why is this about who you are as a person and instead of the kinds of pleasures that we're able to achieve with our body. I hope that kind of clarifies what he means by the idea of homosexuality as now reconstituting populations and persons or subjects as a type of person. So this is that doubly subjected thing again, right? His idea is we're subjected, we become social subjects or persons through these knowledge formations, these knowledge regimes about sexuality that emerged in the 19th century. And we're also subjected to those regimes. So I wasn't exaggerating when I said the Victorian era was a period where people were really interested in sex. They were studying sex and thinking about it a lot. And you see entire works of, entire books like this one, Psychopathia Sexualis, which is essentially about naming and categorizing the extent of sexual, quote-unquote, deviance within a rational, universal frame. So how do we categorize all the forms of deviance? And they have these lovely pictures of all the kinds of ways you can be deviant. So as Foucault is arguing, right, we have these new forms of knowledge that are tied up with new forms of power, right? The reconstitution of who we are as persons, as social persons. Another aspect of biopower that we see a lot of is, for example, here are some examples of posters for public health, right? Again, what we saw with the history of sexuality example was the creation, the organization of populations according to new categories of sexuality, and then the disciplining of individual bodies within that system of categories to normalize and create quote-unquote proper citizens. Through these kinds of public health initiatives, we see that the state is targeting the biological organism as a subject of governance. Now your biological health becomes the purview of the nation state. And again, there's this idea you can see in the back poster particularly, that this idea of health often takes particularly racially and gender-coded terms. Again, the idea, what makes a proper subject? What makes, think of like the 50s and the ways people would have been talking about like what it means to create a strong nation. And the ways that is tied to simultaneous constructions of masculinity and gender, right? All of which are articulated through this realm of public health. So when you hear people talk about biopower, you'll often hear people use these phrases, making live, killing and letting die, or targeting for death and letting die. And the point of Foucault's understanding of biopower is that these are two sides of the same coin. There are certain sets of policies, of techniques that function to make populations live. Demographics, public hygiene and health, prisons, asylums, and hospitals. These are all ways in which this nation state is seeking to extend control over life and to govern life itself. And in many ways, right, when we talk about prisons and asylums, the goal of these places are to make live, to make populations continue to live. But then the other side of that is there are populations who can either be targeted for death or left to die. Again, this has to do with what category you're falling into within this spectrum of citizen, non-citizen. Although we can talk about Beale in a later class because Beale does complicate this in his example of Vita. So targeting for death, we see, for example, genocide, the elimination of racial populations. We see Black Lives Matter. Not Black Lives Matter, but police brutality in the forms that Black Lives Matter is protesting, and the ways in which certain bodies can be marked for death by the police, and that is considered not murder, but killing. What are the kinds of categories that are in operation that allow those kinds of dynamics to happen? But you can also create conditions in which death is just systematically more likely. For example, let's look at the treatment of disability or racial disparities in COVID. It's not that people are being targeted to be killed. It's that they're being left in situations where they're more likely to die. Sometimes I talk about this as the social conditions that predispose you to death. So, for example, when Trump gets COVID, he gets flown to get cutting-edge medical treatments. When I get COVID, in 2020, I didn't have health care because I was a part-time employee here. And so if I got COVID, things would have been kind of bad. I probably would have had to I would have had to figure that out. So there's a way in which, relative to people like Trump, I am predisposed towards death. That's this aspect of biopower that takes the form of letting populations die. We also see this in Beale's work on Vita, the construction of institutions where people are essentially left to die. So Foucault says when he says killing, he obviously does not simply mean murder as such, but also every form of indirect murder. The fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply, political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on. So that's this idea of letting die, that there's techniques of killing that are not as simple as directly killing someone, but rather indirect killing or indirect murder. And that ranges from everything from exposing people to conditions of risk to political death, or what Beale will talk about as social death, the removing of people from the social death that happens in Vita, where even though many of the people there may be biologically alive, they have undergone a kind of social and political death, where they are no longer citizens. So coming back to this phrase that Foucault uses for the title, society must be defended. Again, defended from whom? So when Foucault talks about the theory of biopower, he's interested in how, in the process and the logics of demarcating, isolating, governing, reforming, and or eliminating populations. And we see this in his examples of racial populations, mentally ill populations, criminal populations, and I should have added sexual populations. This is the heart of biopower, right? This logic of demarcating, isolating, governing, reforming, or disciplining, and eliminating populations in order to create a normalized society. So if genocide is indeed the dream of modern powers, this is not a recent return to the ancient right of kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of population. So again, I said Foucault is really interested in making sense of things like the Holocaust. His argument here, it's not that genocide is a return to this older monarchy term, this monarchy right to kill. Instead, it's that death is being operationalized in new ways within new regimes of power and knowledge that function at the level of population. So genocide is a particularly biopolitical formation that emerges because of these population, species, race level dynamics or phenomena. The second thinker I want to talk about briefly is another theorist of biopower, Agamben, who comes up in the Beale reading. Agamben is really building on Foucault and Foucault's understanding of biopower. And his concept really centers on this idea of homo sacer, which translates as the sacred person. Homo sacer was a legal category in ancient Rome. And the idea is essentially the person who it's a person who is outside of society, external to society. It is a person who can be killed but not sacrificed. They're not eligible for like sacrificial purposes, but they can be killed because they are no longer considered part of society. They are no longer protected by the rule of law. Sacred in this context doesn't mean like special or important as much as it means outside. And Agamben talks about this as being included in the form of exclusion. The other it's the other that defines the self. It's that which is excluded to define what is included. And because of that, there's this funny kind of tension where the category of like normal society, quote unquote, needs the other to define itself against, even as it also works to eliminate and exclude that other. And so for Agamben, the reason why Agamben is so interested in this is because he is also interested in the Holocaust. And he argues in his work Homo Sacer that if we are going to understand the nation state, we actually need to understand refugee and concentration camps. It's those microcosms that let us understand the workings of the nation state as a whole. So I gave you a link here. I'll post the link in the description on YouTube, or if you have the PowerPoint, you can just click on it. But go ahead and watch that. This is a video that does a really good job articulating Agamben's ideas. So as you saw in the video, or if you haven't, you will see in the video, Agamben distinguishes between two meanings of life, bios and zoe. When we talk about life, we're usually slipping between the two. Bios refers to political life and citizenship. For example, your right to assembly, whereas zoe refers to animal life. Sometimes he calls it bear life. So for example, your heart beating. So bios, this is your political life, your, for example, rights as a citizen, whereas zoe is your biological life happening. Now the funny thing in the modern nation state is we're being governed as both bios and zoe simultaneously. And there are ways in which these two categories are fundamentally at odds. So for example, when you go to the hospital, you are being governed as zoe. You are being turned into a biological organism or constructed as a biological organism with problems to be solved, which is quite a different form of life than, for example, going to vote. And the interesting thing is the nation state conceives of itself in both of these ways at once, right? On the one hand, the nation consists of the biological life of its subjects. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. I misspoke. The nation state it's made up of the political life, the bios of the citizenry. The nation, for example, in the United States, is supposed to be governed by democratic consensus. We are the nation state. At the same time, the nation state operates by reducing us to bear life, to zoe, and governing us as organisms with the goal that proper state functioning means prolonging and extending life, that life is the ultimate good. And so Agamben writes, for the first time in history, the possibility of the social scientists are made known, and at once it becomes possible both to protect life and authorize a Holocaust. So we see all of these contradictions in play within the ways the modern nation state constructs what it means to be a person, and the way that power operates. On the one hand, it becomes possible to protect life. Hey, let's have public health initiatives to handle COVID. And it's those same logics that also can be used to authorize a Holocaust. Hey, let's send a whole population of racially inferior people and sexual, all kinds of categorized as inferior people into gas chambers and kill them all. It's the same kinds of logics in both examples. So what's happening here, right, is Agamben's concept of the state of exception. Essentially, the state of exception is it's the moments and the spaces where the government is able to legally declare that the rule of law is suspended. So for example, this is a key aspect of how Hitler was able to take power in Germany, is through this construction, the establishment of a state of exception, places where rule of law can be suspended. And there's a contradiction there, right? It's the legal ignoring of law. So at what points can government agencies legally ignore the law? And Agamben's point is that states of exception are everywhere. Again, his idea was the concentration camp and refugee camps. So, as I said before, right, part of what happens in the Holocaust is Jews and other people sent to concentration camps had to be stripped of their German citizenship, made into non-citizens. And in doing this, the rule of law could be suspended within these camps, where now you could kill those people, you could kill people in concentration camps, and it wouldn't be considered murder, legally speaking. It wouldn't be sacrifice. This is his concept. It's not sacrifice, it's not murder, it's killing. But we see this everywhere, right? Again, we see states of exception when police make decisions and shoot people and kill people. When Black Lives Matter are protesting, right? These are moments, those events that they're protesting are moments where small states of exception get declared. And so for Agamben, this is actually really the essential functioning of the nation state, whether we're talking about democracy or fascism. They're both operating the same way here, which is by declaring spaces where they're allowed to exceed and surpass their own law. So what's happening here, right, is biopower functioning as the right to reduce to bare life, to Zoe, and to govern that biological life of populations. Now, this phrase, reducing to bare life, is one you'll see a lot, and it can take a lot of different forms. I'm coming back full circle here to this point I made at the beginning of class, that part of how we are constructed within modern governance, within biopolitical governance, is as biological organisms. So we are constantly being reduced to bare life in order to be better governed. It happens in vita, where people are stripped of their citizenship and transformed into organisms, essentially, through this process that Beale describes as animalization. It also happens when you go to the doctor, and the doctor conceives of you as a set of organs that can be objectively known and studied in order to be properly treated. It's the same problem that Holmes was talking about in an earlier week, talking about the ways in which doctors see migrants and construct the body as a series of organs, and seek to produce objective knowledge about those organs that supersedes migrants' own subjective experiences and expressions of their pain. And so this is really like one of the key logics of the nation state, is reducing populations to bare life so that that biological life can be rationally managed through bureaucratic institutions. And as a result of this, we get everything from healthcare to genocide. So what you should do now for this class is go ahead and post on the discussion forums. There's one form for if you have any questions about the material that you want to ask me or your peers. You can post that there. And beyond that, what I want y'all to do is post into the discussion forum 3 things. 1 comment, and then 2 responses to your classmates' comments. So I've given you several discussion questions here, which you're welcome to use, but if there's something that you are just dying to talk about from the readings, go ahead and talk about that. You can make your post about something totally different, and that's fine. This is a structure to give you, it's to give you structure if that's helpful to you, but if you want to go in a different direction, I'm happy. All right. I'll see y'all next class.